Hang him. The words cut through the thick summer air of Dusty Creek like a blade, and Nora Fletcher felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. She stood at the back of the crowd gathered outside the sheriff's office, her fingers still threaded with the spool of burgundy thread she had been carrying when the shouting started. Around her, men and women pressed forward, their faces flushed with the kind of righteous fury that only came when people had already decided the truth before hearing it. Deputy Harlan Cole stood on the wooden steps with his thumbs hooked into his belt, looking supremely satisfied with himself in a way that made Nora's stomach turn. And in the middle of it all, his wrists bound behind him with rope, his dark hair matted and his jaw set like carved granite, stood Cecil Winslow. He was the largest man she had ever seen up close, built like the mountains that ringed the valley, broad through the shoulders with hands that could grip a fence post like a man grips a pencil. But right now those hands were bound, and his gray eyes were scanning the crowd with the calm, controlled expression of a man who knew he was walking a very thin line between life and an early grave. Cecil Winslow murdered Randall Pruitt in cold blood, Deputy Cole announced, his voice carrying over the crowd with practiced ease. We got 2 witnesses who put him at the scene. We got motive, plain as day. Man's been threatening Pruitt for months over that disputed water rights claim. Now Pruitt's dead and Winslow's the one who put the bullet in him. The crowd surged with noise. Someone threw a clod of dirt. Someone else called out something that turned Nora's face hot with shame on behalf of the whole town. Cecil Winslow did not flinch. He looked up, his jaw still set, and his gray eyes swept the crowd one more time, and for just a moment they landed on Nora. She did not look away. She was the only one who knew the truth. She was the only one who had been there, at the right angle, at the right moment, with eyes sharp enough and a mind clear enough to understand what she had actually witnessed. And she was a woman alone in a town that rarely listened to women, especially one who ran a seamstress shop on the edge of Main Street and had no husband, no father, and no powerful name to lend her credibility. But she had the truth, and if she stayed silent, they were going to hang an innocent man. She pushed forward through the crowd, her spool of thread clutched tight in her fist like a weapon. It had started 3 weeks earlier, in the dry heat of late August 1882, in the small but growing cattle town of Dusty Creek, Colorado. The town sat at the edge of a wide valley where 2 rivers met, and the water rights to those rivers had been the source of argument, bitterness, and now apparently murder for the better part of 2 years. Nora had arrived in Dusty Creek 18 months prior, having saved enough money working in a Denver tailor shop to purchase a small storefront and the equipment she needed to set up on her own. She was 26 years old, self-taught in her craft from the age of 12 when her mother had first put needle and thread into her hands, and by the time she reached Denver, she had refined her skill to something far beyond what most frontier towns had ever seen. She could look at a piece of fabric, feel its weight and weave, identify its origin and composition, and render it into a garment with a precision that left people genuinely speechless. She had an eye for detail that was almost unsettling, a memory that stored visual information like a daguerreotype, and a mind that processed patterns and inconsistencies with the same ease that other people breathed. She had chosen Dusty Creek because it was growing fast, because the cattle ranchers and their wives had money to spend on fine clothes, and because she wanted to be somewhere that felt like it had a future. She had not counted on the water rights dispute. She had not counted on Randall Pruitt or Cecil Winslow or the complicated, tangled web of hidden motives and dark secrets that had been quietly spinning itself around the town for years before she arrived. She had certainly not counted on falling in love. The first time she met Cecil Winslow properly, he came into her shop on a Tuesday morning in early August, his hat in his hand and a look on his face that suggested he would rather be absolutely anywhere else. He was accompanied by his foreman, an older Mexican man named Domingo Reyes, who translated Winslow's discomfort into something more socially functional. "He needs a shirt," Domingo said cheerfully. His good shirt was destroyed when a fence post fell on him last week, and he has a meeting with the land commissioner in 2 weeks. Cecil Winslow stood in the doorway of Nora's shop looking like a bull that had wandered into a parlor. He was 32 years old, with the kind of physicality that made small rooms feel smaller, and he surveyed the bolts of fabric and the dress forms and the spools of thread with the expression of a man confronting a foreign country. "Good morning, Mr. Winslow," Nora said, setting down the bodice she had been pinning and rising from her stool. She was accustomed to men being uncomfortable in her shop. She had learned to manage it efficiently. "I'll need your measurements. Please stand still." He did stand still, which she appreciated. Some men fidgeted so badly during measuring that she spent half the session chasing them. Cecil Winslow stood with military stillness, his gray eyes tracking her movements as she moved around him with her measuring tape, calling out numbers to herself, and committing them to memory with the confidence of someone who had done this 10,000 times. "You're taller than your shoulders suggest," she said, measuring the span from his collar to the small of his back. "You carry yourself low. Most tall men do when they spend a lot of time on horseback." He looked down at her with evident surprise. She was not a short woman, but he was a very tall man, and from this angle she registered as a novelty. "You get that from shoulders," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, deliberate and unhurried, like everything about him had been given careful consideration before it was deployed. "I get that from the way you hold your trapezius muscles," she said, "and from the wear pattern on your coat collar. You've adapted to ducking through door frames. It becomes habitual." There was a beat of silence. She straightened up and moved to note his measurements on her order ledger. 2 weeks is enough time," she said. "I'll have it ready by the 15th. "What fabric are you considering?" He looked at the bolts of fabric as if they were suspects in a crime. Domingo, grinning, suggested the dark blue wool. "That's suitable for the meeting," Nora said, "but impractical for a working rancher. You'll have it, wear it once, and it will sit in a drawer. You want something that reads well in a formal setting but can also hold up to real use. I'd suggest this." She moved to a bolt of dark charcoal gray cotton twill, heavy enough to drape with dignity but breathable enough for Colorado's summer and durable enough to survive contact with the actual world. "It reads well in any light. It photographs cleanly if the commissioner has a daguerreotype man with him, and it will not disintegrate the second time you work in it." Cecil Winslow looked at the fabric. Then he looked at Nora. Something shifted very slightly in his expression, something that might have been the earliest, most reluctant seed of respect. "That one," he said. She built the shirt over the next 2 weeks with careful attention. She had taken accurate note of the fact that his left shoulder was slightly higher than his right, likely from years of roping, and she compensated for it in the cut so that the finished garment would hang perfectly straight across his back. It was the kind of detail that most tailors would miss, that most clients would never consciously notice, but would feel as a difference in the quality of fit. When he came to collect it, he put it on in the small curtained space at the back of the shop and came out looking, quite objectively, like a different man. The charcoal gray set off the silver in his eyes and the dark of his hair. The cut gave breadth to his shoulders without exaggerating them. He stood straighter somehow, as if the shirt had reminded his body of its own dignity. He looked at himself in the small standing mirror and was quiet for a moment. "How did you do that?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Do what?" "It fits." He moved his arms, turned slightly. "I have never had a shirt that fits." "You have unusual proportions," Nora said, carrying on her work at her bench. "Your reach is longer than your height would predict, and your chest is deeper than your chest circumference suggests. Most shirts are made for theoretical men who do not actually exist. I make shirts for the man standing in front of me." He was looking at her again with that careful, measuring quality she was starting to recognize. "How much do I owe you?" She named a fair price. He paid it without negotiation, which she respected, because some men, when they realized they were dealing with a woman alone in business, suddenly remembered a dozen reasons to dispute the cost. At the door, he paused with his old, ruined shirt folded under one arm. "Miss Fletcher," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said, just that. But the way he said it suggested he meant something larger than a shirt. The town's water rights dispute was older than Dusty Creek itself. The two rivers that gave the valley its fertility, the Clearwater and the Miller Fork, converged just west of the town center, and whoever controlled the access to those rivers controlled the economic destiny of every rancher and farmer in the valley. For most of the previous decade, a loose, informal agreement had governed shared access. But as the cattle industry grew and land prices rose, the informal arrangement had curdled into a formal conflict. On one side was Randall Prout, who had arrived in the valley 7 years ago with considerable capital from a railroad family back east, and had used it to purchase a significant claim on the Miller Fork's southern bank. Prout was a man of about 50, silver-haired and smooth in his manner, with the kind of surface charm that people tended to mistake for sincerity, until they had known him long enough to see the calculation behind it. He had political connections that reached as far as Denver, and he was not shy about reminding people of this. On the other side, and on nearly everything else in the valley, was Cecil Winslow. His family had been in the Colorado Territory since before it became a state, working a cattle spread that now encompassed nearly 3,000 acres on the eastern ridge of the valley. His rights to the Clearwater's north tributary were older than any legal document Prout could produce, and Prout had spent the last 2 years attempting, through various legal and less legal means, to either buy Winslow out or squeeze him out. He had succeeded in neither, which Nora gathered had left Prout with a particular kind of frustrated, dangerous fury. She learned most of this gradually, from the women who came to her shop for alterations and new dresses. Small-town seamstresses were the recipients of an enormous quantity of local knowledge, because the act of standing still for a fitting left women free to talk, and women talked. She learned about the court filings, the fence-cutting incidents, the argument at the land office 6 months prior where Prout had apparently told Cecil Winslow that one way or another, the Winslow family would be gone from this valley before spring. She also learned from Domingo Reyes's wife Maria, who came for a new Sunday dress in late July, that Cecil Winslow was a man who had built himself from the ground up in ways that went beyond land and cattle. His father had drunk himself to death when Cecil was 17, leaving behind a ranch so deeply in debt that any practical person would have walked away. Cecil had not walked away. He had worked and worked, and worked for 15 years, and what he had now he had made entirely with his own hands and his own stubbornness. "He does not trust people quickly," Maria Reyes told Nora, standing with her arms slightly lifted while Nora marked the hem of the dress. "But when he does, he would die for them. He is that kind of man, a rare kind." Nora thought about the shirt and the way he had looked at her when it fit. She did not say anything. She finished the hem. On the evening of August 22nd, Nora was working late. This was not unusual. She often worked past sundown, the lamplight perfectly adequate for fine stitching once she had positioned it correctly, and the quiet of the evening shop suited her particular brand of focused concentration. She was finishing the final seams on a gown for Mrs. Aldous Hartwell, the wife of the bank manager, a complicated piece with 12 panels in the skirt and decorative boning in the bodice that had required a full week of careful construction. Her shop's front window faced east, looking directly across Main Street to the alley between the surveyor's office and the feed store. At this hour, Main Street was largely empty, the saloon's noise drifting from the far end of the block. The rest of the town settled into evening. The lamp on her work table threw golden light across her hands and the gown, and through the window, the street outside was lit by the pale light of a near full moon. She was not watching the street. She was watching her stitches. But she was aware of it in the way that a person who lives alone becomes aware of their surroundings in a nearly constant background-level way, registering the presence and absence of sound, movement, light, change. It was the change in the quality of the shadow across her window that first caught her attention, and she looked up without really meaning to. Two men were in the alley across the street. The moonlight was strong enough, and the angle of the shadow just right, that she could see them with a clarity that surprised her. One of them was Randall Prout, his silver hair catching the moonlight in a way that was unmistakable. He was arguing with someone, his posture sharp and gesturing, and the other man, standing partially behind the corner of the feed store, was just visible enough for her to note his build and his hat, a flat-brimmed style she had seen before, and the particular set of his shoulders. The argument escalated. She could not hear the words. She could read the body language with the same precision she read fabric, and what she was reading was rage on Prout's part and something colder, more controlled on the other man's part. Then Prout stepped forward and the other man stepped back, and for a moment the moonlight fell clearly across the second man's face. It was not Cecil Winslow. She was certain of this. She had stood close to Cecil Winslow on 2 occasions and taken his measurements with her hands, and she knew the particular geometry of his body with the thoroughness of someone who had built something to fit it. The man in the alley was narrower through the chest, shorter through the torso, and younger in the way he carried his weight. He was wearing a coat she did not recognize, but his hat she had seen. It was Deputy Harlan Cole's hat, the distinctive flat brim with the cord around the crown. Then Prout grabbed the other man's coat, and the other man shoved him hard, and Prout went down and did not get up, and the other man stood over him for a long, still moment before turning and walking quickly away, back through the alley, out of her sight. Nora sat completely still for 30 seconds. Her needle was suspended in midair, forgotten, and she was running back through what she had seen with the meticulous mental precision of a woman who had been cataloging visual detail her entire professional life. The man who had been with Prout in that alley was not Cecil Winslow. She knew what she had to do, and she was also acutely aware of what she was about to walk into. She set down the gown, turned down her lamp, and went out into the street. By the time she reached the alley, 2 other men had come from the direction of the saloon, drawn by a noise she had not been able to hear from inside. Randall Prout was lying in the dirt, and the look on his face and the stillness of his body told her everything. One of the men from the saloon was already running toward the sheriff's office, shouting. The trap had already been set. She understood this with a clarity that was almost physical, like stepping into cold water. By morning, the whole town knew that Randall Prout was dead, and that Cecil Winslow had been found at the edge of town with a recently fired pistol. The 2 witnesses that Deputy Cole had referenced were men who had been in the saloon and claimed to have seen Cecil heading in the direction of the alley earlier in the evening. The motive was the water rights dispute, which everyone in Dusty Creek already knew about. The case against Cecil Winslow was clean, and it was convenient, and it was entirely constructed from things that looked like truth without being truth, which was the most dangerous kind of lie. Nora went back to her shop, sat down at her workbench, and thought very carefully about what she was going to do next. She was not a fearless woman. She was honest enough with herself to know the difference between courage and the absence of fear, and what she was contemplating required actual courage, because if she was right about what she had seen, then the person who had actually killed Randall Prout was a deputy sheriff with political backing and the town's trust, and he had apparently already set up a perfectly constructed trap to put the blame on someone else. A woman who disrupted that arrangement would not be thanked for it. She might very easily be dismissed, ridiculed, or worse. But Cecil Winslow would hang for a murder he did not commit, and she was the only person who knew it, and that knowledge sat in her chest like a stone she could not put down. She spent the night thinking and preparing, because she was also a practical woman, and walking into a fight she might lose with nothing but her word was not her style. By morning, she had a plan. She was at the sheriff's office at first light, before the crowd had gathered, while Sheriff Tom Aldridge was still on his first cup of coffee, and in a considerably more rational state than he would be once the town pressure began to build. Aldridge was a man of about 55, a decent man in the general way of things, not corrupt but not particularly courageous either, the kind of man who kept the peace by finding the most convenient available explanation for events and accepting it. "Sheriff," Nora said, sitting down across from his desk with her hands folded and her spine straight, "I need to tell you what I saw last night." He listened. He was courteous about it, which she appreciated, and he did not immediately dismiss her, which she had half expected. But she could see, as she spoke, the conflict playing out across his weathered face, the calculation of what it would mean to take her seriously against the neat, convenient package that Deputy Cole had apparently already delivered to him. "Miss Fletcher," he said when she had finished, "I appreciate you coming in, but what you're describing is you at night through a window at a distance, identifying a man in shadow." "I identified him by build, movement, and a specific piece of distinctive clothing," Nora said. "Sheriff, I am a professional seamstress. My entire work depends on the accurate observation and retention of physical characteristics. I measured Deputy Cole's new uniform jacket 6 weeks ago. I know his shoulder width to within a quarter of an inch. The man I saw in that alley last night had the same shoulder width, the same narrow torso, and the same flat-brimmed hat with the cord around the crown. It was not Cecil Winslow. Mr. Winslow's chest measurement is 5 inches deeper and his shoulders are 3 inches broader. I built a shirt for him 2 weeks ago. I cannot be wrong about this." There was a long silence. "You're saying my deputy killed Randall Prout," Aldridge said carefully. "I am saying the man I saw in that alley was not Cecil Winslow. I am saying that man's physical characteristics match Deputy Cole's with a specificity I can document. I am saying that Cecil Winslow is about to be hanged for something he did not do, and I am the only person who can stop it, and I need you to help me." Aldridge set down his coffee cup. He looked like a man who had just been handed something very heavy and was trying to decide if he was strong enough to carry it. "If you're wrong," he said. "I am not wrong," Nora said. "I have never in my professional life been wrong about a physical measurement. But I understand the weight of what I'm telling you, and I am not asking you to take it on faith alone. I am asking you to give me the opportunity to demonstrate it." Demonstrate it how? This was the part of the plan she had spent most of the night refining. "Harlan Cole's jacket," she said. "The one I made him 6 weeks ago. Bring it here, and bring him here, and bring Cecil Winslow here. I will show you the difference between those two bodies in a way that removes all ambiguity." The morning passed in a kind of controlled tension. The crowd began to gather outside as word spread that Cecil Winslow had been taken into custody for Prout's murder, and the mood of that crowd was moving in the direction that crowds in small western towns moved when they had decided something and wanted it resolved. Nora heard them through the office walls and kept her expression neutral and her hands still in her lap. Aldridge sent a deputy to fetch Cole's jacket from his rooms. He was careful about it, sending a man Cole didn't expect and giving no indication of why the jacket was needed. Cole himself was on duty outside, managing the crowd, which gave Nora a chance to observe him through the office window. He was not a physically distinctive man. Average height, average coloring, a face that slid out of memory almost before you finished looking at it. But he carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who was certain he had gotten away with something, and that confidence had a visible quality, a slight looseness in the walk, a satisfaction in the jaw that Nora catalogued and filed. When the jacket arrived, she spread it on the sheriff's desk and stood back. "Fetch Cecil Winslow from the cell," she said to Aldridge, and something in her voice apparently conveyed the appropriate level of certainty, because he did. Cecil Winslow came out of the cell and into the office looking like a man who had not slept and who was not sure whether this new development was better or worse than what he had been contemplating in the dark. His gray eyes found Nora's face immediately, and something in them tightened, a question he was too controlled to ask out loud. "Mr. Winslow," Nora said, "will you put on this jacket, please?" He looked at the jacket on the desk. He looked at Nora. He looked at the sheriff. Then, with the deliberate patience of a man who had decided to follow this thread wherever it led, he picked up the jacket and put it on. It did not fit. It did not fit in ways that were immediately, obviously visible to anyone in the room. The shoulders sat inside his own shoulder line by a full 3 inches. The chest pulled so badly across his front that the button placket spread open without any buttons fastened. The sleeves ended halfway down his forearms. The jacket that fit Harlan Cole like a second skin was, on Cecil Winslow, a piece of evidence so clear it was almost embarrassing. Sheriff Aldridge stared at it. Cecil Winslow looked down at himself, then at the jacket, and the calculation in his eyes shifted as he began to understand what Nora was doing. The man who was in that alley with Randall Pruitt last night could put this jacket on and button every button, Nora said quietly. Cecil Winslow cannot. Cecil Winslow could not have been wearing this jacket or anything built to these measurements, but someone was wearing something built to these measurements in that alley at the time of Randall Pruitt's death, and I know who that someone is. Aldridge sat down heavily in his chair. You'd better be prepared to say this in front of witnesses, he said. That is exactly what I am prepared to do, Nora said. Bring Deputy Cole in here. Let him explain to you where he was last night, and then we'll see what his explanation sounds like. What happened next moved with the speed that things move when a hidden truth finally decides to surface. Aldridge called Cole inside under the pretense of needing his account of the arrest for the official record. Cole came in with his habitual confidence and sat down across from the sheriff and began to speak, and then he saw the jacket on the desk, and the confidence cracked. It cracked in a way that Nora watched with the same careful attention she brought to everything. He covered it quickly, reaching for a new story, and he was quick enough that a less observant person might not have caught the moment. But Nora caught it, and she filed it, and when Aldridge looked at her, she nodded. Cole had a dark past with Pruitt that surfaced over the following 3 days as Aldridge, now motivated by the evidence Nora had provided, began to dig. Pruitt had been blackmailing Cole over a theft the deputy had committed 8 years earlier in Kansas, before he came to Colorado. Cole had been paying the man in silence and fury for 2 years, and the payment had finally taken the only form available to a man who had run out of options. He had killed Pruitt and laid the blame on the most convenient available suspect, a man who already had public motive, and who was large enough and solitary enough that the town would believe it without asking difficult questions. It was a trap that had been carefully constructed, and it had very nearly worked. The only flaw in it was a seamstress with a lamp in her window and an eye that missed nothing. On the 3rd day of Aldridge's investigation, with 2 men from the territorial marshal's office now present and the full weight of official scrutiny bearing down, Harlan Cole confessed. He was taken into custody that afternoon, and the formal charges against Cecil Winslow were dropped before sundown. Nora was at her workbench when the door to her shop opened, and Cecil Winslow walked in. She had heard the shouting outside when the announcement was made, had heard the shift in the crowd's mood from the bloodthirsty certainty of 2 days ago to the confused, slightly ashamed buzz of people recalibrating, and she had gone back to her work because she had a gown to finish, and standing in the street watching other people process information was not her particular style. She did not look up immediately. She finished the seam she was running and set down her work before she turned to face him. He was standing in the center of her shop with his hat in his hands, which was the same way he had stood the first time he came in, but everything else about his posture was different. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something open and unguarded that sat oddly on features accustomed to control. "You saved my life," he said. "I told the truth," Nora said. "That's all I did." "Miss Fletcher," he stopped, started again. "Nora, you stood up in front of the sheriff and put yourself between me and a hanging. You have to know what that took." "It took telling the truth," she said again, and she meant it, because in her mind that was the only relevant fact. She had seen what she had seen, and she had said what she knew. The alternative had never genuinely been available to her. She was simply not built for the alternative. You could have been dismissed, he said, if Aldridge had decided not to listen. If Cole had talked his way out of it, you could have ended up in a very dangerous place. Yes, she said, I considered that. And you did it anyway. She looked at him steadily. I did it anyway. Cecil Winslow was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him running through something in his mind with the same deliberate thoroughness he apparently brought to everything. And then he set his hat on her counter and pulled out the chair on the visitor's side of her workbench and sat down. Tell me what you saw, he said. All of it. I want to understand exactly what happened. She told him. She explained what she had been doing and when. She described the angle of the moonlight and the men in the alley, and how she had first noted the shadow change. And she described the process by which she had identified Cole's build and coat and hat. She was precise and detailed and unapologetic about the certainty with which she described her own observations, because false modesty about things she was genuinely sure of was a waste of everyone's time. He listened with his full attention, the same way he had stood still for his measurements, with a complete, unhurried focus that she found almost startling in a world where people generally listen to women with the distracted patience of someone waiting for the relevant parts. When she was done, he was quiet again. Then he said slowly, You know his shoulder width to within a quarter of an inch. I measured him 6 weeks ago, and you held that in your memory. I hold all measurements in my memory. It is necessary for the work. He looked at her for a long moment. That is the most remarkable thing I have ever heard, he said, and the directness of it was so unexpected that she felt heat rise in her face, which annoyed her, because she was not a woman who flushed easily. It is a practical skill, she said, turning back to her work. Miss Fletcher. There was something in his voice that was different from anything she had heard from him before, something that made her set down her needle again and look up, because whatever it was required acknowledgement. I have been ranching for 15 years. I have hired good men and I have had to deal with bad ones, and I have built something out of nothing, which is the kind of work that teaches you to recognize quality when you see it. You are one of the most capable people I have ever encountered, and I have been fortunate enough to encounter several. The warmth in her face was becoming a genuine problem. Thank you, she said carefully. I owe you a debt I cannot repay. You don't owe me anything. I told you what I did. I told the truth. Then let me buy you dinner, he said, with the ghost of something that might very distantly be a smile. Not as repayment, just because I would like to. She considered him across the workbench. He was not a man given to empty gestures. She had already established that. He was not asking out of obligation, and he was not asking out of pity, and he was not asking because she was a woman alone who might need managing. He was asking because he wanted to, and he had the directness to say so without decoration. All right, she said. Dinner was at the Dusty Creek Hotel dining room, which was the town's best approximation of formal, with clean linen tablecloths and actual china, and a cook from Memphis who had made his way west with a repertoire of dishes that were considerably more sophisticated than the surrounding landscape would suggest. Nora wore the blue dress she kept for occasions, a well-constructed piece she had made herself 2 years ago in Denver, cut with the same attention to actual human proportion that she brought to all her work, and she was aware that it suited her the way well-made things always suited the person who understood how to construct them. Cecil Winslow was wearing the charcoal gray shirt she had made him. She noticed this immediately and said nothing about it. They talked for 3 hours. This surprised her, because she had taken him for a man of few words, and he was, but few words carefully chosen covered an astonishing amount of ground. He asked her about her work with genuine curiosity and no condescension, and she explained it, the geometry of pattern making, the physics of how fabric moved with a body versus against it, the particular challenge of building something that looked beautiful and also functioned in the actual physical world of the Colorado frontier. He listened as if these were the most interesting things he had heard in some time, which she suspected they were, because he was a man who valued function, and what she was describing was fundamentally a science of function. She asked him about the ranch, and he described it with a quiet passion that was visible even through his general economy of expression. 3,000 acres on the eastern ridge, a herd that had grown from 50 head when he took over to 400 now, water rights to the Clearwater tributary that his grandfather had established and that were now, with Pruitt's death and Cole's arrest, no longer under threat. The water rights will go to court eventually, he said, but the case was always stronger than Pruitt let on. He knew it too. That's why he was trying the other approach. The blackmail, Nora said. He nodded. I didn't know the full story until Aldridge's investigation. Cole had been under his thumb for 2 years. I knew there was something off about Cole, but I couldn't see the shape of it. He paused. I should have looked harder. You were occupied with your own situation, Nora said. Pruitt was attacking you on multiple fronts. It's difficult to see the full picture when you are inside it. He looked at her across the table. You saw it from outside. I had the advantage of a clear window and a moonlit night, she said, and the advantage of paying attention to what things actually look like rather than what I expect them to look like. That is a skill, he said, not just an advantage. She thought about arguing the point and then decided not to because he was right, and pretending otherwise was false modesty, and she had already said she disliked false modesty. Yes, she said. It is. He walked her back to her shop in the warm, late summer dark, and at the door he said good night with the simple directness that characterized everything about him, and she went inside and stood in the quiet of her shop for a long moment before lighting her lamp, feeling something she had not felt in a while, something she did not immediately want to name. He came back the following Saturday. He said he had come because his foreman Domingo needed a new coat and could Nora take his measurements. Nora looked at him very steadily when he said this, because Domingo Reyes was a man she had met, and she happened to know that Domingo Reyes' wife had already mentioned plans to have Nora make Domingo something for Christmas. But she took Domingo's measurements without pointing this out, because sometimes people needed an excuse to do a thing they wanted to do, and providing the excuse gracefully was its own kind of courtesy. She had dinner with him again the following week, and the week after that. By mid-September it was understood by the town, in the way that these things became understood by towns, that Cecil Winslow and Nora Fletcher were spending time together, and the town had the expected range of responses. Some people found it charming. Some people found it irregular. The women at the church quilting circle debated the propriety of a man calling on a woman who had no family in the area, no male guardian, no established social position beyond her business. Nora was aware of these conversations and entirely unconcerned by them, which was itself the subject of some of the conversations. What she was paying attention to was the man himself. He was not an easy man to know. He had the reserve of someone who had spent a long time learning that most things were best handled by himself, the self-reliance of a person who had built something from nothing and learned not to expect help. He was honest to the point of bluntness and had apparently never seen much use in softening things unnecessarily. He worked in a way that suggested he found the work genuinely satisfying rather than merely necessary, which she respected because it matched her own relationship to her craft. He was also, beneath the granite exterior and the economy of speech, possessed of a consideration that she kept encountering in small, unexpected ways. He noticed when she had been working long hours. He brought coffee sometimes when he came, without making a production of it, just setting it on her counter with the matter-of-fact simplicity of someone who had identified a need and addressed it. He remembered things she said in passing, and asked about them later, which suggested a quality of listening she had not expected. He was also, when he was not in a formal setting, quietly funny in a dry, underplayed way that caught her off guard repeatedly, which she found she enjoyed more than she had anticipated. In early October, he took her out to the ranch. This was not, she gathered, something he did casually, the ranch being his private world in the way that her shop was hers, and she treated the invitation accordingly. Domingo met them at the gate with the comfortable familiarity of a man who had worked for Cecil for 12 years, and regarded him with the particular mix of loyalty and gentle exasperation that long professional relationships developed. The land was extraordinary. She had seen it from the road, but from inside the property, from the high ground where Cecil took her on horseback. The valley spread out below in the golden October light like something from a painting. The Clearwater tributary caught the sun along the eastern edge, winding bright through the brown autumn grass, and the distant sound of cattle came clean and clear across the ridge. She stood still for a moment and let herself just look at it. The sky was that particular Colorado blue that seemed to exist only at altitude, deep and clear and enormous, and the ridge smelled of sage and pine and the faint, cool edge of the coming winter. "It is very beautiful," she said, and meant it without qualification. He was watching her, looking at it, she realized. Not the land, her. "What do you see?" he asked. She considered the geometry of it. The way the elevation changes create a natural drainage pattern that runs exactly where the water rights are. The line between your land and what was Prout's, you can see it from here in the fence line. The wood is older on your side. She paused. The way the light changes the fabric of the grass. At this hour it is almost amber. "Fabric," he said with a quiet amusement. "I think in fabric," she said, unapologetic. He smiled. Not the ghost of a smile this time. A real one, rare and brief, and utterly transforming on a face that kept itself mostly controlled. And she felt the full impact of it in a way that she stored and filed, and was honest enough with herself to recognize. She was falling in love with him. She was not sure exactly when it had started, possibly in the hotel dining room during the first dinner, possibly the morning she had watched him take off the jacket that did not fit him, and understood from his expression that he had grasped what she was doing, possibly the first time he stood in her shop and submitted to her measuring tape with complete, unhurried trust. But wherever it had started, it had arrived now at something undeniable. The question, as always, was what to do about undeniable things. She was not a woman who operated on assumption. She was a woman who looked at what was actually in front of her and worked with what was there. And what was in front of her was a man who had begun to seek out her company with increasing frequency, who listened to her as if what she said was worth listening to, who had told her she was the most capable person he had encountered in some time, and who had just smiled at her on a hilltop in a way that had briefly dismantled her usually very reliable composure. She thought it was probably mutual. She thought she would wait until she was certain. In late October, a letter arrived from her sister in Denver. Her sister Margaret was 3 years younger, recently married to a schoolteacher, and given to writing letters that managed to be both affectionate and quietly full of questions about whether Nora had any plans to, as Margaret put it, settle her own situation. The letter inquired about the town, about the shop, about whether Nora had met any interesting people, and whether any of them might be of particular interest. Nora wrote back a long letter about Dusty Creek and the shop and the water rights case and the autumn light on the ridge, and she said that she had met several interesting people, including a rancher, who was perhaps the most straightforward and capable man she had ever encountered, and she left it at that. Margaret would read between those particular lines with practiced ease. November arrived with its first real cold, the kind that came down off the mountains with ice in it, and the town settled into its winter rhythms. Nora's work shifted with the season, winter clothes and warm linings, and the particular practical elegance of frontier winter fashion, which required a balancing act between warmth and function that she found genuinely interesting to solve. Cecil came to see her on a Wednesday evening in the second week of November. This was not his usual pattern, which was Saturdays, and he arrived at her shop after business hours when she was the only person there, and the particular quality of his expression when he came through the door suggested that this was not a casual visit and not a coat for Domingo. She put down her work. He sat in the visitor's chair and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, which was the posture of a man who was going to say something that cost him something to say. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I have been for most of my life a man who manages things alone, by preference and by necessity both, but mostly by preference." He paused, choosing words with his usual care. "I learned early that needing people was a liability because people left or died or disappointed you, and the only reliable thing was the work. I built the ranch on that principle. It worked. I am not complaining about it." She waited. "You are the first person in a very long time who has made me want to revise that principle," he said. "I find myself thinking about what you would say about things, what you would notice that I missed, what you would look like in a particular light." A pause. "I am not a man who wastes words, and I want to be clear so there is no misunderstanding. I would like to court you properly, with an intention of asking you eventually, when you are ready, to marry me. If that is not something you want, I would rather know now." Nora looked at him for a long moment. The lamp between them cast warm light across his face, the strong line of his jaw, the gray eyes that were watching her with the same careful, steady attention he brought to everything. "It is something I want," she said. He let out a breath. It was not dramatic. It was just a breath, but it told her everything about how much this had cost him to say, and that knowledge softened something in her chest in a way she let herself feel without trying to manage it. "Good," he said simply. She laughed. She could not help it. He was the most consistently, reliably direct man she had ever met, and his version of a declaration of feeling was delivered with the same calm precision as a business proposition, and somehow this was exactly right for him, and she would not have wanted it any other way. "Good," she agreed. He reached across the workbench and took her hand. His hand was large and rough from the work and very warm, and he held hers with the kind of care that large, strong people learn to exercise when they are holding something they do not want to damage. She looked down at their hands on the workbench, side by side, and thought about the geometry of it, how they fit. They were engaged by Christmas. The formal announcement was made on Christmas Eve at the community gathering at the church, and the town had a variety of reactions, most of them eventually warm, because Cecil Winslow was a respected man, and Nora Fletcher had, in the minds of most Dusty Creek residents, gone from unknown newcomer to genuine heroine in the matter of a few months. The Quilting Circle women decided that it was romantic. The men at the feed store decided that Cecil had finally done something sensible. Domingo Reyes, when Nora told him, hugged her with the uncomplicated warmth of a man who had been hoping for exactly this outcome, and his wife Maria cried, which was also uncomplicated and warm. Her sister Margaret arrived from Denver in January for a visit that was nominally about the wedding planning, and actually about meeting Cecil, which Margaret accomplished with the efficient directness of a woman who had been worried about her older sister for years and intended to assess the situation thoroughly. Cecil met Margaret with the same steady patience he brought to all things, answered her careful questions with his characteristic honesty, and apparently passed some internal test, because Margaret took Nora aside on her second day and said, without qualification, "He looks at you the way Papa used to look at Mama. I approve." This was the highest compliment Margaret possessed, and Nora accepted it with appropriate gratitude. The wedding was planned for March, when the worst of the winter would be over and the valley would be beginning its spring greening. Nora made her own dress, of course. This was never a question. She made it in ivory silk that she ordered from Denver, with hand-embroidered details at the collar and cuffs, a full-length skirt that fell without a hoop in the cleaner, less structured style that she preferred, and a fitted bodice that made the absolute most of the particular geometry of her figure. She worked on it in the early mornings before the shop opened, and the late evenings after it closed, and she approached it with the same exactness she brought to every garment, but with an additional quality that was harder to name, something like love made visible in cloth and thread. Cecil, who was apparently constitutionally incapable of not noticing things, saw her working on it one evening when he came to collect her for a walk, and he stood in the doorway and looked at it on the dress form with an expression she had learned to read as deeply moved, which on his face looked very similar to his resting expression, except for a slight softening around the eyes. "You made that," he said. "I am making it," she said. "You are remarkable," he said, in the same tone he might use to note a fact of nature, like the depth of the river or the height of the ridge, and she accepted it in that spirit because this was the language he used for things he meant most. She completed the dress 2 weeks before the wedding, hung it in the back room of her shop, and refused to let anyone see it before the day. They married on the 15th of March, 1883, in the Dusty Creek Church, with Domingo Reyes standing as Cecil's witness and Margaret Fletcher Carey standing as Nora's. Sheriff Aldridge attended, looking considerably less comfortable than he probably wished, which Nora thought was appropriate, since he had come very close to allowing an innocent man to hang, and the appropriate amount of that discomfort belonged with him as a reminder. The ceremony was brief and direct, as suited both of them. Cecil said his vows with the eye contact and careful pronunciation of a man who meant every individual word, and Nora said hers the same way. When he kissed her, it was as thoroughly considered and unhurried as everything else he did, and she was aware of the warm press of his hands on her face, gentle in the way very strong things could be when they chose to be. When they walked out of the church into the March sunlight, Nora Fletcher was Nora Winslow, and the spring wind came down off the mountain smelling of snow and sage and the particular green promise of the coming season. The first year of their marriage was one of the most demanding and most satisfying years of Nora's life, which was saying something, since she had not previously lived what anyone would describe as a comfortable life. She moved into the ranch house on the ridge, a large, well-built structure that Cecil had expanded several times as the ranch grew, solid and practical and largely devoid of decoration, which she addressed gradually, and with pleasure, understanding instinctively that this was a man's house that had waited for someone to bring it the additional dimension that warmth and beauty provided. She kept the shop. This was never in question, and Cecil never suggested otherwise, which confirmed something she had suspected about him from early in their acquaintance. She rode into town 3 days a week, managed her clients and her orders and her craft with the same precision she always had, and came home in the evenings to the ridge and the cattle and the wide Colorado sky. The water rights case was resolved in the fall of 1883, a year after Pruitt's death, when the territorial court ruled in favor of the Winslow claim. The Clearwater tributary stayed exactly where it had always been, on Winslow land, and the legal threat that had shadowed the ranch for 2 years evaporated with a finality that Nora could see in the set of Cecil's shoulders for days after. He did not make speeches about it. He went out the morning after the ruling and walked the boundary of the property, alone, and came back 2 hours later with something settled in him that had been unsettled for a long time. Harlan Cole was tried in the winter of 1882 and convicted of the murder of Randall Pruitt. He was sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison. Nora testified at the trial, giving her account of the night of the murder with the calm precision she always brought to the presentation of observed fact. Cole's defense attorney attempted twice to suggest that her identification was unreliable, and she dismantled both attempts with a technical clarity about the specifics of physical measurement and visual memory that left the courtroom attorney visibly regretting his line of questioning. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Cecil was in the courtroom for her testimony. He sat in the 3rd row with his arms folded and his expression giving nothing away, but she could feel his attention on her like a physical thing, that same quality of absolute focused listening that she had first encountered at her workbench, and she drew something from it that steadied her in a way she had not expected and was privately grateful for. Afterward, outside the courthouse, he came and stood beside her in the cold November air and said nothing, just stood there close enough that his shoulder was warm against hers, which was exactly sufficient. In the spring of 1884, Nora realized she was pregnant. She had suspected it for about 2 weeks before she confirmed it, because she was the kind of woman who did not say things until she was certain, and certainty in this particular matter required some time and a conversation with Dr. Pemberton on the edge of town. Dr. Pemberton confirmed what she had suspected with the manner of a man delivering pleasant news to a married woman, which it was, and she walked home from his office through the spring afternoon, feeling the specific quality of enormous change that was not yet real in the fully material sense, but was absolutely real in every other way. She told Cecil that evening, at the dinner table. She said it directly, which was the only way she said things, and watched his face. What crossed his face in the first moment was something she had never seen on it before. It was unguarded in a way that went deeper than the rare smiles, a kind of openness that had no shield in front of it, something that might in a smaller man have been tears. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his, and he held them for a long moment without saying anything, which was its own kind of speech. "Are you well?" he asked when he finally spoke. "Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said, "and very all right." "Good," he said. And then quietly, "I did not know I wanted this until just now." She squeezed his hands. "Neither did I entirely, but I do." The baby was born in November of 1884 in the ranch house on the ridge, attended by Dr. Pemberton and by Maria Reyes, who had more practical experience with births than any doctor in the county and whose presence Nora had requested specifically. It was a long process and a demanding one, and Nora endured it with the kind of focused, stubborn determination she brought to difficult projects, and at the end of it there was a son. A son. 8 pounds, already loud about his opinions, with his father's dark hair and his mother's watchful eyes. Cecil held him with the same careful, thoroughgoing attention he brought to everything, looking down at the small, fierce, red-faced person in his arms with an expression that Nora watched from her pillow with unguarded satisfaction. "Thomas," Cecil said, trying the name they had discussed. The baby considered this. He did not object. "Thomas Winslow," Nora said. "That fits." Cecil looked up at her, and the look on his face was the complete, undisguised version of every carefully controlled expression she had spent the last 2 years learning to read. It was love, plainly and fully, without any of the managed reserve that usually covered it, and she felt it land in her chest with the warm, permanent weight of something that had always been meant to be there. "Thank you," he said. For the second time in their acquaintance, he said just that, and meant something very large with it. "Reciprocally," she said, and meant something equally large. Thomas Winslow grew with the rapid, absorbing energy that small children deployed on their environments, and the ranch house on the ridge became a considerably noisier place in his wake. He was a curious child, always examining things, always wanting to know why and how and what, and it was rapidly clear to both parents that he had inherited something from each of them: the physical confidence and the practical engagement from his father, and from his mother, the eye, the noticing, the way he would tilt his head and look at something from a new angle until he understood it. By the time Thomas was 3, he was following Domingo around the ranch with the determined absorption of a small person who had decided that horses and cattle were the most important things in the world. And he was also, in the shop on the days Nora brought him along, deeply fascinated by the bolts of fabric and the patterns, pulling out the measuring tape and attempting to use it on the furniture. The shop continued to thrive. Dusty Creek grew through the mid-1880s, new families arriving as the railroad pushed further through the territory, and Nora's reputation had grown beyond the town to the neighboring communities. She had taken on a young apprentice, a 16-year-old girl named Elsie Drummond, whose fingers were quick and whose eye was promising. And training Elsie gave her a satisfaction of a specific kind that she recognized as the satisfaction of transmission, passing something you had built to someone who would carry it further. In the autumn of 1886, she discovered she was pregnant again. This one arrived in May of 1887, when the valley was fully alive with spring. A girl this time, smaller and quieter than her brother had been in those first hours, with her mother's determination already visible in the set of her small jaw. They named her Clara, and Thomas, at 2 years of age, greeted her arrival with a mixture of interest and mild suspicion that was completely consistent with his character. Cecil held Clara the same way he had held Thomas, with that enormous careful gentleness, but there was something additional in it now, the particular tenderness that came with familiarity, the knowledge of what this was and what it became. He looked at Nora over the baby's head with steady gray eyes and the quiet smile that was still rare enough to always mean something. "Two," he said. "Two," she agreed. Life on the Winslow ranch settled into the rich, full complexity of a household that was alive in every room and in every season. Cecil's herd grew to nearly 600 head by 1888, and he hired 3 additional hands and expanded the eastern pasture. Nora's shop took on a second apprentice, and she began taking special commissions from as far as Denver, fine work that her reputation supported, and that stretched her craft in directions she found genuinely satisfying. They argued sometimes, because they were both people of strong opinions and neither was given to yielding on principle, and their arguments had the character of 2 very solid things encountering each other, direct and undecorated, and usually resolved within the day, because neither of them found prolonged conflict particularly useful. They made up with the same directness, and the making up was thorough and warm and entirely sufficient. Nora taught Elsie everything she knew, and Elsie expanded into areas that Nora herself had not explored, a talent for decorative work that Nora encouraged because she recognized genuine ability and saw no point in limiting it. By 1889, Elsie was running the day-to-day operations of the shop with a confidence that allowed Nora to take on the larger commission work that her own skills were suited to. And the 2 of them together built something that was better than either could have built separately, which was Nora's general theory about collaboration between competent people. Domingo Reyes retired from active foreman duties in 1889 at the age of 60, his knees no longer willing to support the pace, and Cecil hired a younger foreman named James Garrett, a quiet, capable man from Kansas whose reference letters Nora read and assessed before Cecil hired him, because she had an eye for the gap between what people wrote and what they meant, and she confirmed that the letters were genuine. Domingo stayed on the property, helping where he could, taking his meals with his wife in the house they had occupied on the ranch grounds for 12 years, and Cecil made it clear without a formal discussion that this arrangement was permanent for as long as Domingo and Maria chose it. This was the kind of thing Cecil did that Nora had come to understand was the truest expression of his character, the loyalty that operated without announcement, the care that manifested in structure and permanence rather than declaration. One evening in the autumn of 1890, when Thomas was 5 and Clara was 3, and the house was briefly quiet with both children asleep, Nora and Cecil sat on the porch of the ranch house in the last of the September warmth, the valley spread below them in the early evening light, the cattle visible at the far edge of the eastern pasture, and the Clearwater tributary catching the last of the sun. She had her mending in her lap because she was never entirely without work, and he had his coffee, and they were quiet together in the way that people are quiet when they have been talking for years, and the silence itself has become a kind of conversation. "I have been thinking," he said. She looked at him. "When I think about the day of the arrest," he said carefully, "I think about standing in that alley outside the sheriff's office with my hands bound and the crowd already decided, and knowing that I had no argument that would reach them. I was looking at the end of everything I had built and I could not see any way through it." She was quiet, waiting. "And then you came through that crowd," he said, "with your thread and your facts. And that particular expression on your face that you have when you know you're right about something and you're not going to pretend otherwise. What expression is that?" she asked. He considered. It is very like the expression you have when you're cutting a pattern freehand without the paper template and someone suggests you should measure it first, she laughed. That is a very specific expression. You are a very specific woman, he said. That was the first moment I understood what you were, not just capable, not just intelligent, genuinely, specifically you. He paused. I knew then that I was already lost. I just did not have the language for it yet. She set down her mending and looked at him in the autumn light. He was 40 years old now, silver at the temples that had not been there 8 years ago. The lines of the ranch years cut deeper into his face, and he was the most beautiful thing she had ever looked at, which was saying something because she had looked at a great deal of beautiful things in her life. You are not entirely easy to love, she told him. No, he agreed, I know that. But it is completely worthwhile, she added, if that needed saying. Something moved across his face. It is good to hear. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the porch settling around them in the early dark, and he put his arm around her and they sat together in the silence of the valley, while the stars came out one by one above the ridge, and the clear water caught their light and ran singing over its stones in the dark below, and the Winslow ranch held its ground on the eastern ridge of the valley as it had always held and would go on holding. The water was secure. The land was secure. The family was real and alive and growing in all the ways that families grew, and the shop on Main Street was thriving, and Elsie Drummond was becoming one of the finest seamstresses in the Colorado Territory, and Thomas Winslow was going to be a rancher, and Clara Winslow was going to be, her mother strongly suspected, something not yet invented. The trap that had been set to destroy Cecil Winslow had not destroyed him. The hidden motives and the dark secrets and the carefully constructed lie had come apart because a woman with a lamp in her window and an eye that missed nothing had been paying attention. Because she had known the truth and refused the silence. Because she had walked into the crowd with a spool of thread and her own absolute certainty, and told the truth out loud, and stood behind it when challenged, and the truth had done what it always did when it was given room to breathe. It had freed him. And in freeing him, it had freed her, in all the ways she had not known she needed freeing, from the solitude she had built her independence around, from the habit of needing no one, from the long, efficient loneliness of a brilliant woman who had not yet found anyone worth being brilliant with. She had found him, in a shirt that fit. In the spring of 1891, Nora discovered she was pregnant for a third time. She told Cecil at the breakfast table with Thomas chattering about horses on one side and Clara carefully dissecting her toast on the other, and Cecil set down his coffee cup and looked at her with those steady gray eyes and said nothing for a moment while the children ignored the adult exchange as children did. Then he said, "We may need a larger table," she smiled. "We may." Thomas looked up from his horse monologue. "What do we need?" "A larger table," his father told him. Thomas considered this. "Why?" "Because there will be more of us," Nora said. Thomas processed this information. "Another baby?" "Yes." He looked at his sister, who was still engaged with her toast and had missed the announcement entirely. He looked back at his parents. "Will it be loud?" he asked, with the world-weary pragmatism of a 5-year-old who had already survived one loud baby. "Extremely," Nora said. Thomas accepted this with the resignation of someone who understood that some things were simply going to happen. The third child arrived in November of 1891. Another boy, smaller than Thomas had been and quieter in the first hours, who looked at the world from his first moments with a calm, observant quality that made Nora think immediately of his father. They named him Samuel, and Cecil held him with the practiced ease of a man who had done this twice before and who had understood, both previous times and again now, that this was the most important work he would ever do. "Samuel," Cecil said, testing it. The baby gazed up at him with dark, attentive eyes. "He is looking at you very seriously," Nora said. "He is assessing me," Cecil said. "He is your son," Nora said. Cecil laughed, quietly, the full laugh that was still rare enough to be entirely precious each time she heard it. The larger table was acquired in the spring of 1892. It was a long oak table that seated 8, built by the furniture maker in Dusty Creek to Nora's precise specifications, the right height and width, and with a particular leaf that extended it further for the days when Domingo and Maria joined them, which was most Sundays. The Winslow house on the ridge was full and loud and warm, and everything that a house needed to be. And on Sunday evenings when the children were in bed, and the old friends were home, and the valley lay quiet in the dark below them, Cecil and Nora sat on the porch with their coffee and their silence and their accumulated years. And the stars were the same stars that had always been there, and the clear water ran below in the dark. And the truth had long since settled into its permanent place in the story of Dusty Creek. The seamstress had seen it. The rancher had been freed. The witness and the accused had become the most solid thing in the valley, more solid than the water rights, more solid than the land itself, built from honesty and trust, and the particular stubborn willingness to see things exactly as they were, and to say so out loud, and to stand behind it when it was difficult. Nora Winslow set down her coffee cup and looked out at the valley in the dark and felt, as she had felt many times since that March wedding in the church, the profound, unglamorous, completely irreplaceable weight of a life that was exactly what it was supposed to be. Not because it had been easy, not because everything had gone smoothly or that the darkness had stayed away, but because when the darkness had come, she had held a lamp up to it and refused to let it win, and what had grown in the light that followed was worth every moment of the cost. Cecil put his hand over hers on the porch railing. She turned hers over and held his hand. Below them, the clear water ran silver in the moonlight, and the cattle were quiet in the eastern pasture, and Thomas and Clara and Samuel slept in the house behind them dreaming their children's dreams, and the valley held its breath in the autumn dark and let the stars be enough, which they were, which they always had been, which they always would be.